How many prisoners would refuse a chance for their own early release? We are here with Yehonathan Pollard, who did just that when he refused to be freed in exchange for Islamo-fascist terrorists that were to be released from Israeli prisons. As we hear Yehonathan Pollard's wisdom and insights, let us keep in mind that they are coming from a symbol of Jewish heroism, whose convictions are backed up by courage, loyalty, and commitment to the Jewish nation. Yehonathan Machon Shilo, led by Rabbi David Bar-Hayim, welcomes you again.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
It's our pleasure to have you always. Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom, once again. I remember hearing a very wise and erudite individual say once that one of the main aims of the early Zionists, shall we say the founding fathers of Zionism, was that Jews should no longer be easy prey for anti-Semites. One of the historic events that gave impetus and urgency to this desire that the Jews not be defenseless, but rather be able to live in their own land and defend themselves and not be at the mercy of their enemies, were one of the occurrences, one of the historic realities was the famous Kishinev pogrom, or Kishinev massacre. In Hebrew, often referred to as Sufot Banegev, but in English it's known as the Kishinev pogrom because it took place in Kishinev, which is modern-day Moldova, in the part of the Russian Empire at the time, in April 1903, according to the Gregorian calendar. During that pogrom, 49 Jews were killed, 92 were gravely injured, a number of Jewish women were raped, over 500 were lightly injured, and 1,500 homes were damaged. I just read that off the English language version of Wikipedia. One of the things that changed the atmosphere and the feeling of many people in Israel occurred in Israel's history, occurred 50 years ago at the time of the Yom Kippur War. Because then, for the first time, the descendants of those original Zionists felt that, well, something's not working here. We almost got wiped out again. And of course, less than 2 months ago, we know what occurred. And those figures that I just quoted regarding the pale in comparison with the unspeakable atrocities and the numbers of the numbers of people murdered, number of homes destroyed, the number of women raped, and I won't go into anything more graphic than that. So, if we take that as a yardstick, if that was the aim of many of the original Zionists, that kind of reality must come to an end, that the Jewish people must achieve a different historical reality vis-a-vis other people, other nations, then clearly the Zionist enterprise, if we assess it at this moment in time, has not been a success. That is the inexorable and terrible fact that we must admit, but it is a fact, nevertheless. The Jewish enterprise, the Zionist enterprise, I should say, which has failed, precisely because as opposed to my Freudian slip a moment ago. It's not a Jewish enterprise, but it's a Zionist enterprise. And therefore, I wish to begin our conversation by asking you the somewhat provocative question, are you a Zionist?
If I could just delay my answer for 1 second.
Answer as you please.
Thank you. You raised a very interesting point by referencing the Kishinev pogrom. Because one of the most important pieces of literature I read growing up as a young boy was Nahum Bialik's City of Dead, The City of Dead. And I felt, which was about Kishinev and how he felt we had just been like lambs to the slaughter, where there was no resistance, there was no opposition. We were just murdered by this howling, drunken mob of pogromists. And it got me so angry that I was absolutely beside myself with rage over how something like that could happen. And it was only many, many years ago, or later rather, that I read a new book on the Kishinev pogrom that had a different story. Apparently, the Jews were arming up at the end. They were getting ready to wreak havoc, vengeance on the pogromists. There were hundreds and hundreds of men. These were workers. I mean, these weren't passive people. These were agriculturalists, they were industrialists. I mean, they were people that worked, so they were strong. And they were all waiting in or organizing in somebody's yard, big yard, with weapons. And they were going to go on the attack. And that was the moment that the Russian police showed up and kind of diffused everything. And I want you to think about that for a moment. We were ready to go on the offensive. The men had armed themselves, and they were not drunk. They were very sober. So the casualties they undoubtedly would have inflicted on these pogromists would have been pretty heavy. And it was the forces of law and order that came and prevented them from either defending themselves or avenging themselves on the pogromists.
Why does that sound familiar?
Yeah, that's the whole point. Why does it sound familiar?
It reminds me of those who constantly berate us with all manner of drivel with regards to international law
and proportionality.
Not that we are in any way, by the way, violating international law
at all.
No way at all. But nevertheless, we're always told that we are, or that we're about to, and therefore you must be terribly careful, etc., etc. And yes, of course, you have the right to defend yourself, but you may not do it in such a way that you will actually succeed.
There you go. Correct. So starting off with Kishinev was brilliant on your part. And this latest book that came out a few years ago really sheds light on the myth of Jewish passivity. We were going to go on the attack to defend ourselves, but were prevented from doing so by our betters. Now, to turn to your provocative question, when people have asked me, are you a Zionist? I like to shock them by saying, not exactly, no. And they look at me in horror. And I say very quickly, because I am a Jew, I am a Jewish nationalist, and that's my form of Zionism. My Zionist origins don't just go back to Theodore Herzl. It goes all the way back to Avram Avinu with Lech Lecha. That is the origin of my Zionism.
Our forefather Abraham.
Correct.
For those who are not terribly proficient in Hebrew.
So Herzl was as you know, was an interesting guy, but he was not a terribly religious fellow. And he was more a product of 19th century nationalism than any kind of proto-Jewish nationalism. There were many before him, rabbis, like one of my ancestors, the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, that started a return to Zion, a return to Zion by his students. And there were many other rabbis in Europe that were part of this effort to reclaim our land, slowly but surely. The problem right now is that secular Zionism, as espoused by people like Theodor Herzl and others, has failed. It has completely failed. And I'm sad to say that our current version of religious Zionism has also utterly failed. Why? Why is this? The secular Zionism reached a peak probably in the 50s and early 60s, and then ran out of steam. Because when you want to be like everybody else, well, why don't you just go live with everybody else? You had Yordim, you had people leaving Israel at that point, or trying to live a life here that was more reflective of Western materialism than it was Jewish idealism and philosophy and values. And as far as the religious nationalism was concerned here, there was too much accommodation, whether it was because they were taking money from the government or because they didn't want to rock the boat when the socialists were in power here. Doesn't matter. When Gush Emunim, when we reconquered the territories, Yehuda and Shomron, and we had the movement, the Gush Emunim movement, to resettle the land, when that came about, you had the flowering again of a true Jewish nationalism. And what's happened to that? Again, it ran out of steam because of accommodation with not just the left, but more incredibly with the so-called right. So right now, both secular Zionism and what goes for religious Zionism, in my opinion, has failed the nation. As far as the massacre that just happened on October 7th, you were 100% right, Rav, to point out the fact that this represented the total failure of what goes for Zionism these days, both both secular and religious, both. And so when people ask me, are you a Zionist? It's not an easy question to answer. So I have to explain the fact that my Zionism is actually defined by the Torah and by our ancestors, like Abraham and like Joshua and the patriarchs.
I would question why, in fact, you feel compelled to state that your Zionism is based on the principles of our forefathers, the principles, the values, the vision of the Torah.
Reality. It's a sad reality.
Why not simply say, I follow the Torah, I believe in the Torah, and Zionism, as formulated by its founding fathers, is not a Torah-based ideology.
It's confusing for people because they don't understand me when I say I follow Torah values. They don't understand me at all.
Please elaborate.
When I talk to I've never run into so many Jewishly ignorant people in my life. When you say to people, for example,
I'm sorry, I must interrupt you. You forced me to interrupt you here because there's a very simple, plain, and obvious reason why you run into so many ignorant Jews, ignorant of anything to do with Judaism. And the reason for that is, I'm sorry to say, Zionism. And that is to say, the Zionist-inspired education ministry. The education ministry certainly over the last 50 years, if not much longer, but certainly over the last 50 years, has been indoctrinating Israel's younger generations with basically nothing about Judaism or
it's worse than that,
or Jewish identity, Jewish philosophy and values, and other foreign ideas, which the origin, the sources of which may be found in various faculties of political science or anthropology or history in all manner of universities, but nothing to do with the Torah.
If it were just a question of not teaching our faith, that would be one thing. You can teach an ignorant person what the truth is because it's tabula rasa. He doesn't have anything. On the other hand, what this establishment here has done under both the left and the right is that they have inculcated a false notion of what Judaism is. They've basically turned out because more than anything else. And when you have left-wing organizations involved as deeply as they are in the educational system here because of money, where they have the right to choose the teachers of religion, so quote unquote, and the children are basically taught, let's be honest with you, lies, then you have the worst possible situation. You have indoctrinated children in a notion of Judaism, which is a lie. And so you have to go back and re-educate them is almost an impossible task by the time they turn of high school age. This is why when I started Esther's Gan in Tel Aviv, which is mostly for secular students, kids, I was more or less attacked by the usual suspects in the media for attempting to brainwash or turn these kids into little, Haredi kids wearing black hats and capotas and everything else. And I said, no, that's not what I intend to do. I intend to reach these children at the earliest stage possible to give them the truth of what our faith is about and why are we here and what our mission is here and what our responsibility is to God, the land, and to Torah. So that
and
by
also
the time
one should mention also just a basic knowledge of Jewish history.
Okay. And they said, why? The reporters. And I said, why? Because I had to be careful with this. I needed them to be able to make an educated choice when they got older and they questioned whether they should remain observant. They should at least know and be educated as to what they may or may not be losing. And that they accepted. And they left me alone at that point. When I first came back home, Esther, alayhi shalom, who was very sick at the time, called me to her. And she said, I want to talk to you about a war that is coming. And it didn't surprise me. I mean, a war. I mean, we always expect a war, correct? But what she said next to me got my attention. She said, but I won't be here to help you. So I listened carefully at that point. And what she said was, this war will be over the Jewish identity of the state. And this is when I first realized to what degree the rot had infiltrated our educational system here. People, at the very least, have to have a reason for living here and for fighting. This is a rough neighborhood, as we've just seen. And unless you have a deep-rooted understanding of why we're here, why God put us here, why God gave us this land, and what we're expected to do to defend this land, it's just easier to leave and go to Miami or Los Angeles or wherever, somewhere else.
All those places, it should be pointed out, are rapidly before our eyes.
Correct.
Becoming
That's why Jewish history is so important.
Non-viable options.
Correct. But this is why, as you pointed out, Jewish history is so important. We kind of live in a world of social media, TikTok and Instagram and all this stuff, where we don't realize, what's in a book. And if we do go back and read Jewish history, this should not come. What's occurring right now, both here and in Galut, I don't call it the diaspora. It is more properly called the Galut, which is because it's a punishment, was inevitable. It's always happened. And it's a conceit on the part of those Jews, liberal Jews especially, who live, and Orthodox Jews, who live in the lap of luxury, diasporic luxury, in places like Lakewood and Monsey and Borough Park and places like that, that it just would pass them by like a diasporic Pesach. They have the blood over the mantle, and the angel of death would just pass because they live in Monsey. Ir HaKodesh, lehavdil, lehavdalot. So a notion of Jewish history, a notion of Jewish culture and values, and a notion of our actual relationship to the Goyim, to the non-Jews with whom we've come in contact over the millennia, are I would call it the defensive equipment that young Jews have to be provided with in order for them to understand what's expected of them if they are to live in this God-given land. And when you look at the educational system, as I have, it's horrible.
I must tell you something, speaking about Jewish or Israeli Zionist secular education. And this is very relevant in terms of recent events as well, as I will explain. I was speaking to this young Israeli boy from a totally secular home, and he was completely unfamiliar with the pasuk, with the verse Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Take note and understand, O Israel, that Hashem is our God, and Hashem is one, and He is the master of all. That is the Jewish confession of faith. He was unfamiliar with it altogether. This is connected to recent events because this past Shmini Asereth, the 21st of Tishrei, the 7th of October, there were cases in some of the settlements, that is to say kibbutzim, villages, towns. For whatever reason, some people like to use the word settlements. It doesn't bother me either way. A town, a settlement, a village, a kibbutz, it's all the same. There were places where Jews who had been surrounded by these Islamo-fascist Nazis from the Hamas, who were trying to get into their secure room in their home, known as a mamad, in other words, a bomb shelter with a special kind of door, and they locked themselves in. And in some cases, these Hamas assailants tried to convince them that they were Jewish, so they would open the door and come out. And and in some cases they shouted out to these Arabs who were pretending to be Jews outside the door of their bomb shelter room, of their safe room in their home. I'll say a word and you give me the next words. They said, Avraham. They were supposed to say Avinu, Abraham, our forefather. They didn't know what to say, so they understood they were these people. They spoke Hebrew and they didn't necessarily sound like Arabs, but they realized they were not who they claimed to be. Later, many hours later, when Israeli soldiers arrived, they had to go through the same thing. These people outside the door were saying, "Open the door. We're here to save you. Open the door." And they didn't know who these people were. They weren't sure. And intuitively, some of the soldiers began to shout out the pasuk to people locked inside behind that door, saying Shema Yisrael. Or they were asked, "We'll say Shema Yisrael. What are the next words of the pasuk?" And they knew how to respond. And immediately, as soon as I heard that story, these terrible, heart-wrenching and horrific stories, I asked myself, what will be in a generation from now, perhaps just a few years from now, when the people locked inside some bomb shelter shout out through the door to the Israeli soldier, well, Shema Yisrael, what's the next word in this confession of Jewish faith? He may be a Jewish soldier, but he may not have a clue.
Correct.
Just think about that for a moment. How low we have fallen.
I don't think we've quite reached the 49th level of Tumah that was facing the Bnei Israel in Egypt, in Mitzrayim, but we're coming very close to that right now. There are lots of children that I've met, children of my friends, whose level of knowledge of Jewish history, Jewish culture, Jewish faith is frighteningly low. And there is when I bring this up to my friends and say, why don't you try to do something about this? And their answer is, no, they'll learn what they want to learn. It's kind of a laissez-faire attitude towards instruction. And we all know that one of the most important responsibilities of Jewish parents are to teach their children our faith. A father that teaches his son or daughter our faith is really to be praised. They don't do that anymore, mostly because they don't know it themselves. In fact, one of the couples at the Gan, when it was dedicated, gave me an interesting answer. I asked them point blank, why are you sending your children here? The wife I think she wore more clothes at the beach than she wore at this occasion. And the husband had metal all over his face, clips and whatever else. But the answer was remarkable. The husband said, our parents neglected to teach us anything about God or why we are here. And we want our children to teach us. And it rocked me back. It rocked me back. And it gave me hope that maybe we are approaching the Geula Shlema, because that idea is incorporated in our notion of the Geula Shlema, that the children will teach the parents. But as far as our educational system is concerned, now we have robbed our children of their right to know who and what they are. We have denied these children the knowledge of why they are here. And they are robbed of their knowledge of what their obligations as Jews in their own land is with regard to our enemies, both without and within. It's as if you take a child, a defenseless child, and throw him into a body of water with sharks. What do you expect will happen? That child is defenseless. He doesn't have to know Krav Maga, and he doesn't know how to shoot. He doesn't know how to box or use a knife. I hardly had any of these weapons when I was in prison, but I had one weapon that saved my life. That was Yirat Shamayim, fear of heaven. And that, again, is something that we are denying our children here.
So here is the point. We have now more or less come full circle. I began by discussing the obvious and dire need for a new vision, a new ideology, a new leadership for the Jewish people, because the secular Zionist paradigm, which was always, from its inception, a very, very flawed ideology and philosophy, because it was bereft of any mooring in the Torah. So what should that new philosophy, that new vision be? And how can we begin to create the nucleus of such a movement to remove us from our present disastrous state of affairs and move us into some better, higher, sunlit upland, to quote Winston Churchill?
There are two approaches. Unfortunately, they've been separated for time immemorial, but there are two approaches that we can take to reclaiming our security, if you will, and our understanding of why we're here and what's expected of us. It's either a bottom-up educational system or a top-down system, usually a political system. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of trying to figure out which is important. We have to pursue both. And what that means is that for the time being, going forward, we have to reinstitute the study, the learning of Jewish laws, traditions, and histories at the lowest level possible in our educational system, as taught by knowledgeable and appropriate teachers. Number one, this is the bottom-up approach. You start as early as you can, inculcating in the children this kind of knowledge. The other approach, which is what I call a top-down approach, is that we older folks, the voters, have to get it through our heads that what we've been doing since the Yishuv was first refounded has not just been inadequate, but has been counterproductive. You know, Einstein once said that a definition of insanity was doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And unfortunately, our voters in this country have been doing just that. What we need on the part of our leadership is a dedication to our right, our God-given right to the land, to the notion of our uniqueness, and our willingness, as Talmud Bavli says, that when someone comes to kill you, rise up early and kill him first. We were never a passive people, ever. We fought everybody. We didn't win a lot of times, but enough times to survive our enemies with God's help. So even if the people we elect don't exhibit exactly the same type of Torah education that I would like them to represent or exhibit, at least if they understood these basic fundamental points, why we're here, who gave us this land, why we're here, and the fact that we have an absolute right to defend ourselves in whatever way we deem appropriate, then we can save the state long enough for this new generation of educated children to mature and take over the reins of government.
You just reminded me of something that happened to me many, many years ago, which I think is relevant to relate here. You mentioned the question, why are we here? Or what is our right to this country? And we all know that the very first Rashi Rashi's commentary on the Torah, the very first statement by Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, 1,000 years ago almost, is to quote a certain statement from Chazal, from our sages, to the effect that our homeland was given to us by Hashem.
Ken.
And that is why it is ours. Because the world, the earth, all of creation is Hashem's, because he brought it into existence. At an earlier time in history, thousands of years ago, it may have been inhabited by other people, the Canaanites, what have you. When it was right and proper in his eyes that it be in their possession, it was in their possession. And when he decided to bequeath it to Avraham Avinu, to Abraham, our forefather, and to his descendants, he bequeathed it to us, and that is why it belongs to us. And some people might find this statement unusual or more in some way anachronistic, but in fact it is extremely timely. As a very wise Jew said to me many years ago, I recall this now, we were actually on a Temple Mount, on Har HaBayit, many years ago. This is probably 30 years ago. And he said to me, that first Rashi, that first statement of Rashi's on the Torah was most definitely written with Ruach HaKodesh, with divine inspiration. I said, why do you say that? He said, because if you think about human history, throughout the ages and up to the present time, the only time that statement makes any sense and is necessary is today, because today many people in the world, many Gentiles around the world ask us and tell us, why do you think this land belongs to you? But that question would never have been asked in the past, because everyone knew in ancient times that people fight wars and conquer one another, and whoever wins, winner takes all. There was no question why you're here. You're here because whatever war there was in the past about this place, you won. You won, and therefore you're here, and the other guy's not here. And that's just how it works. That's how humanity has always worked. But in what generation would someone come to the Jewish people or to an individual Jew and say, wait a second, why do you think it belongs to you? There were some other people here, or I think, or I claim, or I believe, or I was told that other people were here, which is not true. There are always Jews in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, throughout all of history. And the vast majority of the Arabs who
are from elsewhere,
arrived in this country over the last 150 years, only did so in the wake of Jewish immigration,
Jewish settlement and immigration.
Right. Jews returning to their homeland and thus beginning to build up the country, and this produced all kinds of economic opportunities, and thus all kinds of Arabs from surrounding countries came here. And this was a magnet. And this was encouraged by first by the Ottoman Empire, because
the British.
They had their own reasons for preferring this and hoping for this outcome, and then the British. But the point is, the only time in history where such a claim was ever made, to which the response would have to be this response that Rashi quotes, that it's ours because Hashem said so, is now. This is the time when every Jew on earth has to know that first Rashi, because without it, you have no answer.
Correct. But then again, our enemies are very, very shrewd, and what they say is that's a racist answer. That's an exclusion. That's an exclusatory approach. That's an apartheid response.
Not enough DEI there.
Correct. Precisely. So, but it makes no difference what our enemies say. What's more important is what our own people know.
Exactly.
And are willing to fight for.
But if they don't know it,
then
our situation is